Hi, this is Kara Pike Inman, and this is my reading explanation and analysis video for the article Tuition Rich, Mission Poor, Non-Resident Enrollment Growth in the Socioeconomic and Racial Composition of Public Research Universities, which is a mouthful. And this article is by Jacquet, Coors, and Posselt. The basic summary of what this article is about is these three authors looked at enrollment management practices at public research institutions. And what they really found was that these institutions said that they had a commitment to being accessible to low-income students and minority students, but that wasn't necessarily what was put into practice. And what they found is that there was a big kind of some tensions between the commitment to access for these students and the other priorities of the institution and competing priorities, particularly as they related to recruiting non-resident students, so out-of-state students. They use the term non-resident. And what they found, and we've read this before, is that non-resident students tend to have higher incomes when they're going out of state, and therefore they pay more for attendance due to out-of-state tuition and fees. These students are often recruited because they tend to score higher on admissions exams like the SAT. They are less likely to be minority students if they're coming from out of state than in-state students, and that they tend to have characteristics that help increase the rankings and prestige of the university. So again, this is another one of those like how U.S. News and World Report is ruining the world articles. So looking at what they call kind of the iron triangle of enrollment management is there's three parts of this triangle. There's access, there's revenue, and then there's kind of the academic or institutional profile of the institution. So looking at the access side of this triangle, they talked about how institutions used to have, if that's their priority is access, they would have financial aid policies that focus more on need-based aid. So low-income students can access the university. That these institutions, would have a tradition of being this engine of social mobility, and that they would strategically recruit minority student populations. They would go into high schools with, in low-income areas and high schools with a large percentage of minority students, and that's where they would do their recruitment. So in the revenue corner of this triangle is the institution's priority to engage in any kind of behaviors that generate revenue. And some of this may also be recruiting out-of-state students because they are going to have a higher contribution to some of the student revenue goals if they're paying more for the exact same, kind of teaching that they're receiving. And some of this also involves a reorientation of financial aid policies from that need-based aid, which is more on the access side of the triangle, to merit-based aid, which is saying, hey, we want to get some of these out-of-state students coming in because we can give them these scholarships, but they're going to pay more overall. And then the third side of the triangle is kind of the academic or institutional profile. And this is where the institution wants to have that prestige. They want to be ranked highly. They want to be able to be more selective, have, the higher average SAT scores. And don't be disappointed. This article did talk about things like lazy rivers and luxury dorms and climbing walls and all of that, and talked about how having some of those luxury amenities are an attractor for out-of-state students and are contributors towards that kind of more elite institutional academic profile. So what the authors found is that their main research question was whether or not increases in the number of non-resident students were associated with decreases in the number of low-income students and underrepresented minority students. That was their main research question. And statistically, they had found that from the kind of 2002-2003 academic year to the 2012-2013 academic year, non-resident students in these public research institutions were up by 4%. And so with this kind of general research question, they had two hypotheses of what they would find. And they thought that there would be a decline in the proportion of low-income students if the proportion of non-resident students went up, and there would also be a decline in the proportion of underrepresented minority students. Those were their two hypotheses. And it turns out that they found out they were right on those hypotheses, that more non-resident students does typically mean fewer low-income students, and this was a more pronounced difference at prestigious universities, those that are really trying to climb up those rankings, and also more pronounced in states where there tends to be a lower overall income. They also found that underrepresented minority students go down when non-resident student percentages go up. And again, this was also more pronounced at prestigious universities, those states with bans on affirmative action or race-conscious admissions, and also was more pronounced in states that had large minority populations. So in terms of what does this mean and why is this important, is I think this article really gets at the heart of what is the mission of higher education in general, and what's the mission of the specific institution at which we work or with which we're involved. Is our mission to be accessible and to provide education to a lot of students, or is our mission somehow to climb the rankings? And are we keeping our mission in sight when we're creating policies and procedures? And so to really get back to why do we do what we do and what are we here for? I think it's also really important to look at our institutional practices and do what our practices, so our enrollment management decisions, do they align with our state admissions? Are we going into those low income and minority, student populations of high schools to recruit our students, or are we going into affluent out-of-state high schools with higher achieving students that are going to raise our average test score? And depending on which one of those we're doing, does that align with what our mission is? And I think that's something really important that's highlighted in this article. And then to really think about, to what extent do we value things like access? Do we care if these students can get access, or are we really just wanting that prestige? To what extent do we value diversity among our students, and how do we define diversity? And then things like revenue, and how do we value these, and what's the benefit of placing priority on any of these individual factors, and how can we emphasize one corner? So if we go into a tough fiscal time, how can we emphasize the revenue corner of the triangle without ignoring the access and diversity corner? So I think that's a lot of what's really important in this article, is looking at those types of things, is how can we create that balance? And then how do we potentially move away from rankings, or are there certain benefits from rankings that outweigh the drawbacks? But that seems to be kind of a recurring theme in a lot of our readings, is that rankings can cause a lot of evils. So my discussion questions, the first one is, what strategies do you think that universities should take to balance each of these three corners of the enrollment management triangle? Should one of these corners take precedence? Is the revenue corner the most important? If we were one of those institutions we've read about that was about to be closed down, maybe that is the most important corner at this point in time. Is our academic profile the most important? Is the access corner the most important? And so kind of that would be one of my questions, is should one of these take precedence, and how do we balance those three corners? The second question is kind of, in addition to the pros and cons discussed in the article, are there additional benefits or drawbacks for universities in terms of recruiting and attracting out-of-state students? So they talk about how out-of-state students tend to have higher entrance exam scores, and how entrance exam scores are becoming having more influence on admission decisions. And is that a good thing? Is there, do students learn from other students? I know in this program I certainly have. And are those higher achieving students on those test scores going to be able to bring more to the classroom than potentially another type of student? Or do those out-of-state students bring another form of diversity to the classroom that maybe is different than the type of diversity that a low income or a minority student might bring? So those are my discussion questions. It was an interesting read, and I hope you all have a great week.